Hi guys, today we're going to go over Business Law, Gateway Study Guide, sample exam. Question 1. Paul filed a lawsuit for false imprisonment against Dan's bookstore. During a visit to Dan's bookstore, Dan stopped Paul as he left the store. Dan accused Paul of stealing a book from the store. After briefly looking into Paul's shopping bag, Dan determined that Paul did not shoplift. He apologized to Paul and released him. On these facts, Dan will likely A. Win the case because the Shopkeepers Privilege statute gives store merchants unconditional immunity protection from such lawsuits. B. Lose the case because Paul did not shoplift. C. Win the case, but only if a court or trier of fact concludes that Dan had reasonable cause to believe Paul may have shoplifted, detained him for a reasonable amount of time, and in a reasonable manner. Or D. Lose the case because Dan did not have a warrant. Now we're going to go over the elements of false imprisonment. They are 1. Intent. 2. There has to be actual confinement in boundaries not of the plaintiff's choosing. 3. There's a causal link. 4. There's awareness of the confinement. Based on all these facts, the elements are satisfied. However, the shopkeeper's privilege is a conditional privilege that Dan can use. What I mean by conditional privilege is that there's also elements that have to be satisfied under the shopkeeper's privilege. The elements are 1. The owner usually must act with a reasonable cause. 2. The owner must act in a reasonable manner. 3. Must detain the suspect for no longer than a reasonable length of time. In this case, the facts seem to satisfy the shopkeeper's privilege. Therefore, Dan will win his case, but he will only win if the court finds all the elements for the shopkeeper's privilege to be satisfied. Now, reasonable manner would be something that is not outrageous. For example, if the shopkeeper, Dan, uses a means of handcuffing the person that he detains for an unreasonable amount of time, say for an hour or maybe longer, then that may not be considered as reasonable. Again, it's based on what the court deems as reasonable. So we're going to review the answer choices. A is incorrect because the shopkeeper's privilege is a conditional privilege, but it's not unconditional. B is incorrect because the fact suggests that Dan had a reasonable suspicion that Paul may be stealing. D is incorrect because as a shopkeeper, Dan has a conditional privilege to detain Paul. So the correct answer, C. Win the case, but only if the court or trier of fact concludes that Dan had reasonable cause to believe Dan may have shoplifted, detained him for a reasonable time, and in a reasonable manner.